All right, so back on the other side here. What we're thinking about with these plots, so for example, if I had a plot like this here, and I had a bunch of data points that kind of occupied space like this would tell me that there are 3 different types of quadrats based on how they sort out in 2-dimensional space. And these quadrats versus these quadrats, best explained by high abundance values for certain species, and these have low abundance values of those species. And then here, these 2 groups of quadrats separate themselves out based on the presence of other species and the absence of others. So let's go back to the Erie Bluff State Park data. Erie Bluff State Park data. Recall that we're dealing with this abandoned field here, and that what we had done is looked at 245 quadrats and characterized approximately 50 species within these quadrats. Okay? Then took all this data and did this kind of association analysis to see if the field is basically uniform with respect to species, or if at smaller scales than the field there are stronger or weaker associations between species. Do some species tend to associate together, whereas other species are not ever seen together in the same quadrat? So let's go back through here. So this is a picture of that field, right? This is the old field. That's the one that was abandoned. And doing this kind of analysis, 50 axes, right, using the data from the 245 quadrats, is this field one big community, or is it a bunch of smaller communities kind of connected together as loose associations between species within a larger grouping of overall species that is the field? Okay, so what we've got here then are each of these color patterns with the hatching, or black and white pattern with hatching. Each of these represents an association of certain species together relative to the rest of the associations, and there are certain plant species that explain these communities. In other words, this particular grouping would be this one here and this one. So these 2 groupings of species occur in 2 different parts of the field. The first one, Ambrosia, Artemisia from lab, you've seen this one, that's ragweed. And then Arabidopsis, this is a watercress, but it's also that model system for flowering plants that we also were about to work with in lab before the shutdown. What this says is that these quadrats, or these areas between the field, are best explained by the positive association between these 2 species, and these 2 species don't tend to occur in the rest of the field in this association. That this part of the field is best explained by the presence of these 2 species, this strong positive association. Here, Chenopodium album and Vitis riparia, that's this, and that. Those quadrats there are best explained by the presence of Chenopodium and Vitis riparia, that's river grape. So these two species strongly associate together in these quadrats where they're not associated in the other quadrats. Okay. Here, Cenchrus, those of you that went to the Bahamas, you know one of those species from down there, that's that sand spur. We have a couple species in Pennsylvania, including Tribuloides. And then Viola arvensis is kind of a trashy old field violet. Those two species are associated together in certain parts of the field. That's this, no, get the color pattern exactly right. That's these three here within the field. Draba verna is actually a rare species in Pennsylvania. Phytolacca is a pokeweed, which is an invasive. So you have this weird positive association between an invasive and an endangered species in Pennsylvania, but that association is found right wherever that hatch mark is. So here, 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 and here, right? Then you have this group of species, looks like it's close to the edges of the field. That is explained by the positive association of all of these species, including oak and a relative of the tomato, okay, in the same genus. Does that make sense? So for the old field here, the idea is that at least in the first year following abandonment, it probably doesn't make sense to think of the old field as a community. It is because we've artificially described its boundaries, right? That's the field, that's where the plow used to plow and now it doesn't anymore. But really it's not a homogeneous mixture of species, and it probably shouldn't be thought of as one. It's actually the grouping of different species in different parts of this old field forming these associations, whether positive or negative. One of the explanations for why you might get this in the first year is, well, this may be due exclusively to the dispersal of these species. What we're seeing in terms of species in the field is best explained by the dispersal patterns of these weeds colonizing this field. And I don't use weed lightly. A lot of these species are weedy. That's their job, is to colonize these newly disturbed habitats. Think the plowing everything under in the fall. These species disperse into those areas, colonize those areas, but colonization is not perfect, right? They get lucky and land in certain places and not others. And what we may be seeing here are patterns of movement into the field by species that are very close by. Right? If you notice, Caniza here, which is the most abundant species in that field. It's very abundant, but its pattern of abundance here is interesting because it tends to just be at this end of the field. There are places elsewhere where it occurs, here, 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 but mostly here, because probably the colonizers, and I know this from being out in that field, are over here, and the wind probably blew those seeds into this area, and a couple of them got this far, but they just didn't happen to land in those areas. Okay? Does that make sense? So closed communities, we tend to think about differently than open communities. Open communities, we've got some thinking to do about what a community actually is. Is it a loose association? Is it just groupings of species within this larger entity that we kind of arbitrarily make up because we know where the boundaries of it are? Or is this something that should be considered as a unique entity? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, now, in ecology, hopefully one of the things you're starting to get out of this is that things change, that the planet is constantly changing, that the number of individuals right, over time tends to change in predictable ways, right, depending on what model we're using, but things don't tend to stay the same. Things are constantly changing. Well, communities can also change as well. And we'll refer to what's changing in the community as the community structure. The structure is the identity of the species themselves. Which species are part of the community? That's the community structure. Okay? It's not richness, it's how the community is constructed. Right? You construct the community by using these species to build that community. Okay? All right, and as we think about these changes in community structure, we're going to call this kind of predictable change in community structure I'm going to call this succession. Now, I'm going to propose a few different models of succession for you, but this predictable change in how species enter into the community and leave the community, that's part of this predictable pattern, we refer to this as succession. Now, successional theory, when this notion of succession first developed, right, this notion of successional theory first developed, it was after the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is occurring in the late 1800s in the United States. Right, I probably had its role too in the Civil War as well, right, the North with its ability to produce things, and the South with its mostly agrarian society. And, but in any event, as the U.S. becomes more industrialized, people begin to leave the farms and go to find jobs in the cities and factories. And as you do that, there are fewer people that are farming. And that's a trend that's continued into today. It used to be that in the late 1800s they said that 18 out of every 20 people was on a farm. And today I think it's like 1 out of 200 or something. It's a crazy number. But in any event, as people were leaving the farms, the fields that were being farmed were being abandoned. And we say that these fields are left to go fallow. So fallow fields. Much like this field that Jamie was working in, go all the way back to the beginning here. This is one of these abandoned fields, right? It's an old field. That's the other term for it. Old field, abandoned field, fallow field. And because when ecology was getting started in the late 1800s, there were lots of these old fields kicking around. So lots of people were interested in predictable changes in community structure. And this became a body of theory called old field succession. Okay? All right, I'm going to take a short break here, and I'll see you on the other side. All right? Thanks.